October 23rd, 1944. A humid jungle canopy, somewhere over Morotai. The scream of the P-38 Lightning had faded into an unnerving quiet, a vacuum filled only by the drone of a million insects. Then, silence. A white parachute blossomed against the endless green, a ghost descending into a world that did not want it. 23-year-old First Lieutenant John Jack Riley of the 13th Air Force was falling, his body a ragdoll beneath the silk. The Japanese garrison saw him, a prize. From the newly carved Pitu airfield, American spotters saw him, a problem. But someone else was watching too, someone hidden. Maybe from the deep ravines near the Pilowo River, maybe from the thatched huts of Godalalamo village, where the smoke of cooking fires clung low to the ground. Nobody spoke aloud, but whispers began. Rumors. Rumors always existed in the occupied islands. Whispers that traveled faster than a military runner, carried on the sea breeze from one coastal village to the next. They said a skyman had fallen. They said he was alone. A dangerous word followed these whispers, a word that promised either salvation or a shallow grave. Betrayal. Morotai was the key. An obscure mangrove-choked island suddenly thrust onto the center of the world stage. General Douglas MacArthur needed it desperately. He called it his unsinkable aircraft carrier, the pivotal, hard-won base from which his bombers would pound the Japanese in the Philippines, just 300 miles away, paving the way for his promised return. The Battle of Morotai, a footnote in many histories, was therefore not just a battle for an airstrip. It was a battle for the future of the Pacific War, a campaign waged not only with bombs and bullets, but with loyalty and defiance. The official archives tell one story, a folder thick with data titled Operation Tradewind, After Action Reports 4445. It details sorties flown, bomb tonnages, enemy aircraft destroyed. It is a clean, efficient narrative of military conquest. But another file exists, a thin manila folder rediscovered in a declassified batch in 1987, stamped with the dismissive marking Illander Assist Unverified. The cover sheet stated its contents were anecdotal and not suitable for official combat records. Inside there are no numbers, just names. Names of pilots like Lieutenant Riley, men who vanished from the sky only to reappear weeks later, emaciated but alive at the edge of the American perimeter. And beside their names, other names. Filipino names. Villagers who guided them, fed them, and hid them from vengeful Japanese patrols. Many of these local names are followed by a single chilling annotation. Status unknown, presumed executed by Kempe Tai. The Japanese had their own word for this secret aid. Urajiri, the ultimate betrayal. An act of defiance punishable not just by death, but by the eradication of entire communities. This is the story of that price, of how simple villagers, armed with nothing but courage, committed the one act the Japanese Empire could not forgive. May 28, 1944, Brisbane, Australia. A map lay spread under the harsh electric light, a very large map. It showed an ocean, blue and vast, dotted with islands that looked like green smudges on a pane of glass. One man stared at it. He always stared at the maps. General Douglas MacArthur. His promise to return to the Philippines was more than a strategy. It was a crusade, a personal vow whispered into the hot, humid air of the Pacific. But the map was a cruel master. The map showed distances. The jump from New Guinea to the Philippines was too great. Far too great. The workhorse fighters, the P-38 Lightnings, the P-47 Thunderbolts, they didn't have the legs. Their fuel gauges were tyrants. 750 miles from the Allied base at Biak to the southern tip of Mindanao. An impossible stretch of water. They needed a stepping stone, an airfield closer. An unsinkable aircraft carrier parked in the sea. The planners, the colonels with their sharp pencils and tired eyes, they all pointed to the same place. Halmahera. It was the obvious choice. A large, spidery island sitting squarely between New Guinea and the Philippines. It had harbors. It had flatlands for airfields. It was perfect. Perfectly deadly. Intelligence reports flowed in. They weren't whispers. They were screams on paper. The folder was called Enemy Dispositions Moluccas. The report stated Halmahera was a fortress, a bastion. The Imperial Japanese Army's 32nd Division, under Colonel Kisoyoshi Tsuda, was dug in deep. Bunkers, artillery, coastal defense guns. 50,000 troops. 50,000! That's more than the entire population of Reno, Nevada. 50,000 men waiting to die and to kill. General Walter Kruger of the 6th Army saw the casualty projections. The numbers were cold. Cold and sharp like a bayonet. An invasion of Halmahera would be a bloodbath. A meat grinder that would chew up an entire American corps. Biak and Peleliu would look like skirmishes. The plan was scrapped. Halmahera was a dead end, a trap. And then the main thing started. Someone, maybe a junior intelligence officer, maybe a photo interpreter staring at reconnaissance prints until his eyes bled, pointed to a smudge. A tiny speck just northeast of the Halmahera spider. Morotai. Nobody had paid it much mind. It was small, underdeveloped, covered in jungle and swamp. A forgotten piece of the Netherlands East Indies, but the new file, codenamed Trademark, told a different story. A story of opportunity, a story of immense, overlooked value. The reconnaissance photos from a lone F-5 Lightning were grainy, but they were clear enough. One crude airstrip at Pito. A single abandoned G-3M Nell bomber sitting on the grass. The Japanese garrison? Maybe 500 men. Maybe less. A ghost force. 50,000 on Halmahera. 500 on Morotai. The numbers didn't just talk, they shouted. A sketch was drawn on a translucent overlay, placed carefully upon the main map. A simple grease pencil diagram. It showed Morotai's location relative to the nearby islands. A wide view first. New Guinea, a sprawling beast to the southeast. The Philippines, an elusive prize to the northwest. Between them, the Molucca Sea, a blue void. A line drawn from Biak fell short of Mindanao. A long, failing line. Then a closer view. Halmahera and Morotai side by side, separated by a narrow strait. Halmahera, the angry behemoth. Morotai, the quiet neighbor. So close, yet a world away in strategic calculation. The Japanese had fortified the castle and left the back door just 2 miles across the water, wide open. MacArthur saw it. General George Kenney, his pugnacious air commander, saw it too. The southern and western coasts of Morotai were a gift from God. Flat coastal plains. Swampy, yes, but flat. The kind of flat that bulldozers and army engineers loved. Pito Bay offered a deep water anchorage, protected from the sea. It was all there. Everything they needed. The final sketch was drawn. A series of concentric circles radiating from Morotai's southwestern tip. The first circle, the combat radius of a P-38 Lightning, easily enveloped the southern Philippines. Mindanao, Davao, the key targets. It was the key in the lock. Morotai was the key. Morotai, always Morotai. The decision was made in that room, under that harsh light. Operation Globetrotter. The invasion of Morotai. The date was set. September 15th, 1944. September 15th, 1944. The waters off Morotai. The armada was vast. Warships, transports, landing craft. 84,000 men of the U.S. EMIT Corps and the 31st Infantry Division. They braced for impact. They expected machine guns to chatter from the palms, mortars to rain down on the beaches. They expected the hell of a contested landing. The ramp of the first Higgins boat slammed down onto the white sand of a beach codenamed Red. Silence. A humid, unnerving silence broken only by the cry of exotic birds. The GIs walked ashore. They didn't run. They walked. No shots were fired, no resistance. The 500 Japanese defenders under one Colonel Takeo Uchi had mostly retreated into the impenetrable mountains, leaving behind a token force that melted into the jungle. The landing was unopposed. The battle for Morotai was not against the Japanese. It was against the island itself, the mud, the malaria, the torrential, unending rain. The Seabees and aviation engineers descended, men from Ohio, Texas, California. They came with bulldozers, graders, and mountains of crushed coral. They worked 24 hours a day. Electric lights burned all night, turning the jungle fringe into a nightmare landscape of noise, sweat, and steel. They fought the swamp, and they won. First, Wama Airfield, a fighter strip. Then Paito Airfield, which they called Fighter 2. Then the big one, a heavy bomber strip 8,000 feet long, built on a sea of rock and coral dredged from the bay. An industrial city grew from the primeval ooze. Docks, fuel depots, hospitals, barracks. Within a month, the hum started, the low growl of a P-38 warming up. Then another, then a dozen. Within 6 weeks, B-24 Liberators were lining the massive new runway, their bomb bays full. The Japanese on Halmahera, just a few miles away, could only listen. They sat in their useless fortifications, 50,000 strong, bypassed and starving, listening to the thunder of American air power taking off day and night. The thunder was always pointed one way, north, towards the Philippines. The key had been found, polished, and placed in the lock. Now all that was left was to turn it. September 15th, 1944. Gotalalamo Bay, Morotai. It was quiet. Too quiet. The kind of quiet that gets under a man's skin. The landing craft ground onto the white sand beaches, ramps slamming down to disgorge men of the U.S. 31st Infantry Division, Dixie Division, who splashed through the turquoise surf expecting a wall of fire, a storm of lead. They found nothing, not a shot, not a shout. Just the gentle sigh of the ocean and the chattering of unseen birds. The objective was simple. The airfields. 2 of them partially constructed by the Japanese and then abandoned. Wama Airfield, close to the beach. Pito Airfield, a little further inland. A map found in a Brisbane planning room showed them as neat rectangles carved from the jungle. The key to the Philippines. The key to the whole damn war in the Pacific. General Charles P. Hall, commander of Ordnance Corps, stepped onto the sand. He looked at the dense green wall of jungle. He looked at the sky. Empty. The Japanese were gone. Vanished, or so they said. The initial intelligence reports were clean. Minimal enemy presence. Minimal. Barely 700 men of the 2nd Provisional Raiding Unit were believed to be on the island. 700 men against an Allied invasion force of over 60,000. The numbers didn't lie, but the jungle did. Deep in that jungle, Colonel Kusao Uchi watched. He was not on the beach. He was not at the airfields. His men were shadows, phantoms. They whispered about Colonel Ouchi in the American command tents, a ghost, a man who could move his soldiers through the jungle without leaving a trace. A survivor of Guadalcanal. He knew how to wait. He knew how to bleed an enemy. His 700 men were not an army. They were a disease, a fever that would take hold slowly. That's how it began. The Seabees arrived. The U.S. Naval Construction Battalions. They worked under the oppressive heat, under the constant humming presence of the jungle. They brought everything: bulldozers, Marston matting, fuel drums, ammunition, coffee. Within days, the abandoned Japanese strips began to transform. Paito Airfield became a sprawling complex, a city of steel matting and canvas tents. The first P-38 Lightnings landed, their silver skins shimmering in the tropical sun. Then came the B-24 Liberators. Heavy, powerful. The island was becoming a fortress, an unsinkable aircraft carrier. And then the main thing started. The Japanese on Halmahera, just a narrow straightaway, could not let this stand. Halmahera was a hornet's nest, 37,000 Japanese troops. The headquarters of the Second Army. From there, they watched the lights on Morotai grow brighter every night. Electric lights burned in every tent, even at dawn. From Halmahera, they decided Morotai had to be retaken, or at least bled white. The order went to the 211th Infantry Regiment. Reinforce Auchi, attack the airfields, destroy the bombers. The attempts began as a trickle, a nightly gamble across the Wasilewski Strait. The Japanese used barges, Daihatsu-class landing craft. Slow, clumsy, packed with soldiers of the 211th. They moved only in the darkest hours, engines muffled, men silent. They were ghosts on the water, hoping to slip past the American patrols. They were hoping, but the Americans had their own ghosts. The Mosquito Fleet, U.S. Navy PT boats, patrol torpedo boats. Plywood nightmares armed with torpedoes, cannons, and heavy machine guns. They stalked the strait every night, a deadly game of cat and mouse played out in the blackness. The radio chatter was terse. Bogey bearing 190. Engaging targets. The night would explode. Star shells bathed the scene in a ghastly, flickering magnesium light, revealing the barges wallowing in the swell. The tracers were red lines stitching the darkness. Green lines answering back. Explosions. Shouts swallowed by the roar of engines and gunfire. The after-action report of PT-489 read like a fever dream. Sighted 3 barges engaged with 40mm and 20mm. First barge exploded. Second returned fire, then sank. Third attempted to beach, neutralized by gunfire. Neutralized. A clean word for a messy business. Hundreds of Japanese soldiers from the 211th Regiment never touched Morotai's shore. They ended up in the strait. Food for sharks. A terrible, silent reinforcement at the bottom of the sea. But some got through. Always some got through. A dozen here, 20 there. They melted into the jungle, finding their way to Colonel Auchi. His army of ghosts was growing. When the sea route proved too costly, the sky became the battleground. Japanese air raids became a nightly ritual. Sirens would wail across Pito Airfield. Men would scramble for slit trenches. The bombers came from Halmahera, from Celebes, from places that were just names on a map. Kai-21 Sally bombers. Kai-48 Lily bombers. They flew low and fast. The bombs were not large, but they were numerous. They cratered the runways. They turned parked aircraft into frameworks of twisted, burning metal. One night, a single raid destroyed 15 Allied planes on the ground. 15! The Seabees would work all night, filling craters, patching the steel matting, so the dawn patrols could take off. It was a battle of attrition, a battle of shovels and sweat against high explosives. The tension built through October, through November. Small patrols clashed in the jungle. A sudden burst of fire. A few men dead. Then silence again. The Americans held the airfields and the coast, a thin perimeter. A sketch from the time shows it clearly, a small, secure bubble of light and order, surrounded by an ocean of green, hostile darkness. The Pito airfield complex was a grid of runways and taxiways. The perimeter was a thin, jagged line of foxholes and machine gun nests. Outside that line was Auchi's world. December, the rainy season. The jungle dripped constantly. Morale was low. Nerves were frayed. The nightly air raids, the constant threat of infiltration. Rumors spread like wildfire. Rumors of a massive Japanese buildup. They said Auchi now had thousands of men. Not 700. Maybe 2,000. Maybe 3. Men who had slipped through the PT boat screen. Men who knew the jungle better than they knew their own homes. The folder was called Operation WA. The plan, pieced together from captured documents and radio intercepts, was audacious. A coordinated, all-out assault to overrun Pito Airfield. It was set for Christmas. It came a day late, December 26, 1944. The night was pitch black, the rain a torrential downpour that muffled all sound. Just after midnight, the perimeter erupted. The Japanese attacked from three directions at once. They came out of the jungle not as a disciplined wave, but as a screaming, frantic horde. They had bayonets fixed. They carried satchel charges. Their target was the airfield, the planes, the fuel dumps, everything. Men from the 136th Infantry Regiment, hunkered down in their waterlogged foxholes, were suddenly fighting for their lives. Flares hissed upwards, illuminating scenes from hell. Japanese soldiers covered in mud, clambering over the wire. Americans firing machine guns until the barrels glowed red. Screams, gunfire, explosions. It was chaos, a savage, close-quarters fight in the mud and the rain. The main thrust hit the northeast corner of the Pidu perimeter. Colonel Uchi led it himself, a phantom no more. They broke through in several places. For a few desperate hours, the fate of Morotai hung in the balance. The Japanese were inside the wire. They were among the tents. They were running toward the parked B-24s with explosives in their hands. The battle raged until dawn. By sunrise, the attack was broken. The fields around the perimeter were littered with bodies, hundreds of them. The cost had been immense. For the Japanese, it was a catastrophe. Ouchi's army was shattered, broken. But the fight wasn't over. It was never over. As American patrols cautiously pushed out from the perimeter in the following days, clearing the jungle, they found the bodies of the attackers. On one dead Japanese officer, they found a map, a detailed sketch of the Pito airfield's defensive positions, the machine gun nests, the mortar pits, the command posts. It was almost perfectly accurate. Far too accurate for an army that was supposed to be a ghost. The question hung in the humid air, more chilling than any night raid. How did they know? September 21st, 1944, a small village near Pito Airfield, Morotai. The Japanese had a word for it. Hako Ichiu, the 8 corners of the world under one roof. Their roof. They told the villagers of Morotai they were liberators, brothers, freeing them from the Dutch, the white man. For 2 years, the villagers smiled. They bowed. They provided labor. They watched. And they waited. The Japanese believed the smiles. A fatal mistake. Because the smiles were masks, and behind the masks the villagers were whispering. Whispering to the sea, to the jungle, to the spirits of the ancestors, and soon to the Americans. Then the Dutch came back. Not with an army, not with a fleet. They came back in the pockets of the Americans. A handful of men in strange uniforms. The Netherlands Indies Civil Administration. NICA. A very fancy name. A very official name for a government in exile trying to reclaim a lost world. Lieutenant van der Zee, a thin man with eyes that had seen too much in Java, stepped onto the sand at Gotalalamo Bay. He had a briefcase, a Dutch flag, and a list of local chiefs. His job was to re-establish sovereignty, to turn collaborators, to make the new order look like the old one. He thought it would be hard. He was wrong. The people were waiting. Not for the Dutch exactly, but for the end of the Japanese. They knew, the village elders knew, the fishermen knew. The women who washed clothes in the river knew. They knew the trails the Japanese used at night. The hidden streams where patrols refilled canteens. The caves in the limestone cliffs where ammunition was stored. The Japanese thought they were invisible in the jungle. They were not. The jungle had 1,000,000 eyes, and all of them belonged to the local people. Raiden Masjoko, the chief of a village north of the Doroba River, had kept a secret ledger, a mental ledger. Every Japanese soldier billeted, every patrol route, every stolen bag of rice. He walked into the American command post on the 17th, 2 days after the landing, and laid it all out for a stunned intelligence officer from G2 section. Not with maps, with words, with memory. A human map. The dynamics were a tangled knot, a deadly knot. For 2 years, the villagers had lived one life. A life of quiet subservience. They planted sweet potatoes for the Japanese garrisons. They watched as Filipino fishermen, caught far from their homes in Mindanao and stranded by the war, were forced into labor gangs. They saw the beatings, the casual cruelty, the arrogance of the conqueror. A young man named Ismail bin Haji from the village of Buho Buho later told an American field historian about it. His voice was flat, emotionless. They took the best fish. They took the young girls for comfort. They said we were all Asians, brothers, but they acted like gods, angry gods. Then came the Americans, with their chewing gum, their mountains of supplies, their bulldozers that ate the jungle for breakfast, lunch, and dinner. The choice was not a choice. It was survival. A patrol from the 31st Infantry Division, the Dixie Division, got lost. Hopelessly lost in the green hell northwest of the Pito Strip. For 2 days they circled, rations low, morale lower. Then a man appeared, as if summoned from the earth itself. He was small, barefoot, wearing only a loincloth. He carried a parang. He pointed, he made gestures. He led them for 6 hours through terrain, not on any map, depositing them, exhausted and grateful, within sight of their own lines. He asked for nothing. Cigarettes, a can of sea rations. Then he melted back into the jungle. His name was never recorded. He was just a guide. There were hundreds like him, unsung, unseen, the true masters of the island. And then there were the Filipinos, the forgotten civilians of the campaign. They had been here for generations. Traders, pearl divers, fishermen. They had family in Zamboanga, in the Sulu archipelago. They hated the Japanese with a different passion, a personal one. They had seen what happened in their homeland. A rumor, a whisper on the salt wind, spoke of the bamboo fleet. Small fishing prahus slipping between the islands at night. From Morotai to Mindanao, to the guerrillas of Colonel Wendell Fertig. They carried messages, medicine, people. They were spies. Not for the Americans, not for the Dutch, for themselves. For their own fight. The file on them was thin, almost non-existent. The official histories barely mention them, but they were there. Shadows on the water. This cooperation came at a terrible price. The Japanese were not gone. They were hiding. Thousands of them pushed into the impenetrable mountains of the interior. And they had long memories. A patrol stumbled upon the village of Gorapati, or what was left of it. The report was classified, but fragments leaked. Whispers in the mess tents. The village had been a key source of intelligence for the Allies. Someone talked. A Japanese patrol had come down from the hills. Silently. In the night. There were no survivors. The huts were burned, the wells poisoned, a warning, a brutal, bloody warning. That's how it began to unravel. The Dutch flag flew over the new NICA headquarters. A small flag, a stubborn flag. Lieutenant van der Zee worked day and night, appointing local officials, trying to impose a sense of Dutch order on the American chaos. He was restoring an empire the size of Western Europe with a staff of 12. It was absurd. It was impossible. But the machine was moving. The Americans needed the island secure for the real prize. The Philippines. The locals needed protection from the starving, vengeful Japanese still in the hills. The Nika needed to prove they were still relevant. A convergence of needs. A fragile alliance built on fear and opportunity. And then the main thing started. It wasn't a soldier. It was a boy. A boy named Tinos from a coastal village. He couldn't have been more than 13. He had been scavenging near an abandoned Japanese command post in the Tabelo region, a place the Americans hadn't cleared yet. He found something. Something the Japanese had left behind in their haste. He brought it to a Nika officer wrapped in a piece of oilcloth to protect it from the rain. Inside was a map, a detailed Japanese military map, but it didn't show troop positions or artillery placements. The officer at Captain de Vries smoothed it out on his desk. He stared. The map showed a series of deep tunnels, tunnels that went far inland into the heart of the island's highest mountain, the Sabatai. And in the center of the tunnel network, there was a single hand-drawn symbol. A character brushed in black ink. It was not a military symbol. It was the kanji Gui, demon. September 21st, 1944. A small village near Pito Airfield, Morotai. A whisper could kill you. A bowl of rice could kill you. A shared glance, a moment of hesitation, a path not taken. Any of these could lead to the Kempe Tai, to the bamboo cages, to a public beheading in the village square. Everyone knew they had seen it happen, to neighbors, to friends, to family. So they said nothing, but the jungle spoke. It spoke of a falling star, a man-made star of metal and fire. Second Lieutenant David Davy Jones, 23 years old, from a place called Columbus, Ohio. His P-38 Lightning, the Ohio Bell, had been torn apart by anti-aircraft fire from the airfield. He wasn't a star. He was just a boy, bleeding in a swamp, a bone sticking out of his leg. A clean white bone. A child found him. 12-year-old Ramon. He was supposed to be checking his family's snares for wild pigs. Instead, he found a white man, pale as a ghost, muttering about baseball and a girl named Sue. Ramon did not run. He did not scream. He watched. He listened. Then he vanished back into the green wall of the jungle. That's how it began. The decision was made in darkness. Under the floorboards of the hut belonging to the village elder, Apo Simeon. Not a meeting, just 4 people. Ramon's father, Thomas, his mother, Elena, the village healer, a woman they called Lola Basyang, and Apo Simeon himself. The risks were not spoken of. They hung in the humid air, heavier than the scent of coconut oil and fear. The Japanese garrison was less than 3 miles away. 3 miles. A short walk for a patrol. A very short walk. They would help him. The reason was simple. A promise. General Douglas MacArthur's promise. I shall return. It was a phrase whispered like a prayer, a talisman against the occupation, a hope for liberation, a hope for the real independence that America had promised for 1946. This downed pilot was not just a man, he was a symbol, a down payment on that promise. A piece of the returning army, fallen from the sky. To save him was to save a piece of their own future. A future they were dying for, literally dying for. Hiding a man like Lieutenant Jones was an art form born of desperation. He was too tall for their homes, too white for their world. They couldn't put him in a nipa hut. The walls were woven palm fronds. You could see right through them. A patrol would spot him in a second, so they dug. Tomas and 2 other men dug a hole under a massive banyan tree at the edge of the village, its tangled roots providing a dense, impenetrable curtain. They lined it with banana leaves. It was a grave, a living grave. Elena brought him food, a small ball of rice, a piece of dried fish. Food she took from her own children's mouths. The reports from USF File 77A9, a post-war debriefing, detailed the meals. Subject stated he was fed twice daily, usually rice, sometimes a type of root vegetable. The report did not mention that each grain of rice was a gamble, a death sentence if discovered. Lola Basyang, the healer, tended to his leg. She had no morphine, no sulfa drugs. She used what the jungle provided, a poultice of boiled guava leaves to fight infection, a splint made from bamboo bound with rattan vines. Her hands were wrinkled and sure, the hands of a survivor. A charcoal sketch found decades later in a dusty box in Ohio shows her face, drawn by Jones on a piece of tree bark. Her eyes are deep set, her expression unreadable. Beneath it, a single word, angel. The days bled into one another. A week, then 2. Jones lay in his hole, drifting in and out of fever dreams. Above him, the village held its breath. The Japanese came. They always came. A patrol of 5 soldiers led by a Sergeant Watanabe. They were looking for supplies: chickens, pigs, rice. They strode through the village, their boots kicking up dust, their arrogance a palpable force. They questioned Apo Simeon. He bowed low. He smiled. He offered them rice wine. His heart, he later told his grandson, was beating so hard he thought the Japanese could hear it. A drumbeat of terror. They searched 2 huts. They kicked over a cooking pot. They left with 3 chickens. They did not go near the banyan tree, but they couldn't keep him there forever. His leg was healing, but he needed to move. The word went out. Not by radio, not by telephone. It went out on the bamboo telegraph. A network of whispers, of trusted couriers, of fishermen and farmers who formed the invisible web of the resistance. A runner from a neighboring village arrived at night. A name was given, a rendezvous point, a time. The guide's name was Miguel. He was a farmer with the eyes of a hunter. He knew the jungle, the secret trails, the rat lines that snaked through the mountains, away from Japanese eyes. The plan was to take Jones 30 miles north, to a secluded cove where a guerrilla submarine was said to make contact. Said to. Rumors, whispers, nothing was certain. The night of the departure was moonless, pitch black. Elena pressed a small cloth bundle into Jones's hand. More rice. A piece of smoked meat. She said nothing. Her son Ramon stood in the shadows, watching the tall American he had found. He did not wave. He simply watched. Apo Simeon grasped Jones's arm. "Go with God," he whispered in the local dialect. "Tell them we are here. Tell them we are waiting." Miguel led the way. Jones, leaning heavily on a crutch of wood, followed. They melted into the jungle. The path was a lie. There was no path. Just a tangled nightmare of vines, thorns, and mud. Leeches clung to their skin. The air was thick with mosquitoes and the chattering of unseen things. Every shadow was a Japanese soldier. Every snapped twig was the cocking of a rifle. Every hour was an eternity. They walked for 2 days. On the 3rd morning, they were nearing the coast. The air tasted of salt. Miguel suddenly stopped. He raised a hand, his body rigid. He pointed. Ahead, through the dense foliage, was a clearing. And in the clearing, a small hut. A fishing hut. Smoke curled from its roof. It was too close to the rendezvous point. It was not on their map. Miguel's eyes narrowed. He motioned for Jones to get down, to be silent. They lay in the undergrowth, hearts pounding. The hut was wrong. Everything about it was wrong. Then they heard it. Not the sound of local dialect, not the sound of Tagalog. It was a sharp, guttural command, in Japanese. A trap. It had to be a trap. The bamboo telegraph had been compromised. Or maybe it was just bad luck. The worst luck. Miguel looked at Jones. There was no fear in his eyes, only a grim calculation. He drew his bolo, the long, heavy knife of the Filipino farmer. It was all they had, a knife against rifles. Against an empire. He looked back at the hut, and then he saw it. Something that made his blood run cold. A signal, but not for them. And he knew they were not just caught in a trap. They were the bait. September 21st, 1944. A small village near Pito Airfield, Morotai. A whisper could kill you. A bowl of rice could kill you. A shared glance, a moment of hesitation, a path not taken in the jungle. Any of these could be a death sentence. The Japanese Kemputai had eyes everywhere, or so it seemed. They had ears in the rustling palms. Spies behind the woven mat walls. Paranoia was a fever, and everyone on the island had it. To help a downed American pilot was not just an act of defiance. It was suicide. A slow, deliberate suicide for you and your entire family. They knew this. The villagers of Morotai, the fishermen, the sago farmers. They knew the price. And they paid it. The house of Yusuf was the first to burn. A patrol, led by a man they called Sergeant Tanaka, arrived just after noon. Tanaka, a man whose face seemed permanently fixed in a mask of mild distaste, did not shout. He simply pointed. One finger. The soldiers, younger men with nervous eyes, doused the thatch roof with kerosene. The smell was sharp, chemical, an offense to the island's natural scent of salt and frangipani. Then came the match. A single tiny flame. The thatch exploded. Yusuf's family, his wife, his 3 small children were forced to watch. They stood silent. Tears were a weakness Tanaka looked for. They gave him none. That was their victory. A small victory. A victory measured in ash and smoke. A later report filed by an Allied intelligence officer, a Captain Miller, stated it plainly. The folder was called Native Cooperation and Retaliation. The report read, "Reprisals are systematic. The objective is not annihilation but psychological dominance. They burn one house to terrorize 20. They execute one man to silence 1,000. The report was clinical. It did not mention the smell of burning memories. It did not describe the wail of a child who has lost her only doll. Yusuf, Amir, Saleh, a man named Daud. Their homes were gone, wiped from the earth. That's how it began. And then the main thing started. There is a story, an oral tradition you can still hear if you find the right elder in the villages around Galela. A story about a boy named Budi, maybe 12 years old. His father was Hassan, a fisherman, a quiet man, a man who knew the currents better than he knew the faces of his own children. One evening, a man fell from the sky. Budi saw him first, a white parachute snagged in the high branches of a banyan tree, a ghost against the twilight. Hassan found the pilot, a young American lieutenant with a broken leg and eyes wide with fevered pain. He was from a place called Ohio. He said the word slowly as if it were a prayer. Ohio. Hassan made a choice, a simple choice, a choice between life and death, his own. He brought the pilot to the old sago processing hut, deep in the mangrove swamp where the air was thick and the ground was never truly solid. Budi was the lookout. For 3 days he watched the paths, his heart a frantic drum against his ribs. He would bring small parcels of smoked fish and fruit. He watched his father, a man who had only ever set broken bones on seabirds, clean the American's wound with boiled salt water and pack it with herbs that smelled of clove and earth. The pilot, whose name was Mac, drew pictures in the dirt with a stick. A house with a pointed roof. A woman with long hair, a small stick-figure child. He was trying to say something, trying to cross the gulf of language with a simple drawing, a sketch of a life he might never see again. Hassan would just nod, his face a mask of grim resolve. Imagine the scene, a drawing in a forgotten sketchbook, the clandestine meeting, a dark, humid night, the jungle a pulsing wall of sound, insects, frogs, the distant call of a night bird. 4 men crouched under the stilt-propped floor of a hut near the coast. One of them American, Mac, pale and shivering with fever. The others local men, Hassan, Yusuf, whose house was now a patch of blackened earth, and 2 others. Faces carved from shadows by a sliver of moonlight. They passed a coconut shell filled with precious water. A silent communion. No words were needed. The shared risk was a language all its own. The shared risk was a bond stronger than blood. They whispered plans. The coast. A fishing prahu. The Allied lines were miles away, an ocean away. It was impossible. It was their only hope. But silence was not a perfect shield. Silence could not stop a stray word. Rumors traveled on the humid air, passed from boat to boat, from village to village. Someone had talked. A trader from Ternate, perhaps, who saw something he shouldn't have. Maybe a woman forced into service at the Japanese barracks overheard a careless boast. The Kempetai heard it too. They always heard. The atmosphere in the village changed. The patrols became more frequent, more brutal. They stopped searching for contraband. They started searching for traitors. A new notice was nailed to the great banyan tree where the pilot had been found. Simple characters painted in stark black ink on a rough wooden board. Aid the enemy, die like the enemy. It was not a warning, it was a promise. The Japanese always kept their promises. The end for Hassan came not with a shout, but with a quiet visit. In the pre-dawn gray, when the air was cool and the village was still asleep, two Kempeitai soldiers came to his hut. It was Sergeant Tanaka himself. He did not bring his pointing finger this time. He brought only his quiet, impassive face. Booty, pretending to be asleep on his mat, watched through slitted eyes. He saw his mother's face drain of all color, becoming a mask of pure, primal terror. Hassan stood up. He did not struggle, he simply looked at his wife, then at the sleeping form of his son. A long, final look. They didn't take him to the garrison for questioning. They didn't take him to the banyan tree. They walked him down the path that led away from the village, towards the new, raw scar on the landscape. Toward the Pito airfield, toward the sound of American engines and the very men he had tried to help. Hassan never came back. No one ever saw him again. But days later, a message did. A single piece of paper folded into a tight square, left on the family's sleeping mat in the middle of the night. It wasn't a threat. It wasn't a demand. It was a name. Just a name, written in clumsy, blocky letters. The name of the American pilot. Mac. October 30th, 1944. Pito Airfield, Morotai. For every 100 men who flew a B-24 Liberator out of Morotai, 57 would not complete their tour of 30 missions. Not 57 wounded, not 57 transferred, 57 dead or missing. A coin toss with a crooked coin. Every single time they climbed into the belly of that beast. Every single time. The air was thick with coral dust and the smell of aviation fuel. A constant grinding roar of engines being tested, tuned, and pushed to their limits. This was the tip of the spear, the absolute edge of the Allied advance. From the newly carved runways of Wama and Pito, the big birds flew. The B-24s of the 13th Jungle Air Force. Their targets were a litany of despair for the Japanese Empire. Balikpapan, Kendari, Makassar, Davao, oil refineries, shipping lanes, troop concentrations. Targets hundreds, sometimes thousands of miles away. Long, grueling flights over endless blue water and impenetrable green jungle. Going out was the mission. Coming back was survival. And survival was a luxury. A flak burst over a refinery in Borneo. A Zero fighter appearing out of the sun over the Celebes Sea. A sudden, violent squall that could tear a wing off. There were 1,000 ways to die. The jungle swallowed planes whole. The sea gave up nothing. A downed airman was a ghost, a name on a list. A telegram delivered to a quiet street in Peoria, Illinois by a boy who didn't want the job. 24-year-old Captain Frank Hollis. 21-year-old Sergeant Bill Jensen. 19-year-old Corporal David Chen. Gone. But then something started to change. A rumor. A whisper in the mess halls. A story told over warm beer at the officers' club. Someone knew a guy whose crew went down over Halmahera, and they came back. All of them. Thin, covered in sores, but alive. They walked back. Walked back through 100 miles of Japanese-held jungle. It was impossible. Nobody believed it. But the facts were there. Facts are always truthful. The folder was thin. Cardboard, stamped top secret. Inside, it wasn't called a network. It was called Emergency Recovery Procedure, unassisted. A sterile bureaucratic name for a thing of blood and sweat and unbelievable courage. It was a web of ghosts and whispers, a system built on trust in a world where trust got you killed. The villagers, the quiet men and women in the kampongs of Halmahera, Ternate, and the Sangihe Islands. They were the key. They risked everything, not for money, not for ideology. Sometimes for a handful of salt, a parachute knife, or the promise of medicine. Sometimes for nothing more than a shared hatred of the Japanese occupiers. A whisper could get a whole village executed, a footprint in the wrong place. But they did it. They fed them, hid them, guided them, a chain of humanity stretching through the green hell. Look at the diagram, a declassified sketch once called Annex B Air Operations Radius. It shows Morotai at the center, a tiny dot. From it, lines radiate outwards like a spider's web. The first circle, 500 miles, covers Halmahera and Western New Guinea. The second, 1,000 miles, reaches the Philippines and Borneo. The third, the extreme range, touches the shores of Java. This was the B-24's hunting ground, a vast territory, a vast graveyard. From Pitot, the 5th Bombardment Group, the 307th Bombardment Group, they flew into this web every day, every single day. And the web was hungry. The survival networks changed the math. It was a game changer. Suddenly, a risky mission deep into enemy territory wasn't a guaranteed suicide run. There was a chance. A small chance. But it was there. The morale of the aircrews skyrocketed. They flew with a little less ice in their veins, knowing a safety net, frayed and uncertain, but a net nonetheless, was spread below. They flew harder. They pushed their luck further. They won. The strategic impact was immense, incalculable. Air superiority wasn't just about planes in the air. It was about pilots who were willing to fly them, again and again and again. Here is another drawing, not a neat military map. It's a copy of a sketch made on a piece of rice paper, drawn with charcoal by a man named Sergeant Thomas Riley, a gunner on a B-24 called Tropic Lightning. It shows a crude outline of a piece of coastline on Halmahera. A series of dots connects a crash site in the mountains to a specific cove on the coast. Each dot is a village. Lolobata, Wasile, Subaim, Kao. Next to the dots are names. Yusuf, Hassan, a village elder named Marcus. These weren't just places. They were stations on an underground railroad. Riley's crew of 10 men was passed from village to village for 28 days. They were hidden in huts, in pigsties, in holes dug beneath the jungle floor. Japanese patrols swept through Wasil twice. They found nothing. The silence of the villagers was absolute. On the 29th day, they reached the cove, the rendezvous point, the final station. They were told to wait for a signal. 3 fires on the beach. At dusk. The crew of the Pacific Tramp wasn't so lucky. Flak over Kandari had shredded their port wing. Captain John Miller, 28, from San Diego, gave the bailout order. 10 men tumbling into the green abyss. Miller landed hard, his ankle shattered. He saw 2 parachutes, only 2. His navigator, Lieutenant Abe Goldstein, and his tail gunner, a kid named Petrie. They found each other by nightfall. The rest, gone. For 3 days they stumbled east, away from the coast, deeper into the jungle. Their hope was a sliver, a fading ember. On the 4th day, a boy found them, no older than 10. He didn't speak. He just stared. Then he made a gesture. "Follow me." He led them to a small clearing, a hut. An old man sat weaving a basket, his face a mask of wrinkles. He looked at the Americans, at their torn uniforms, their frightened eyes. He spat on the ground. He said one word. Jepang. Japanese. Then he pointed in the opposite direction and held up 5 fingers. 5 days. A 5-day walk to a village that might help. He gave them a papaya and a bamboo tube filled with water, and then he pointed back into the jungle. He would not help them further. The risk was too great. Miller, Goldstein, and Petrie were on their own again. But now they had a direction, a destination, a chance. They walked. For 5 days they walked. They ate insects. They drank from vines. On the 6th day, they stumbled into a village. The villagers stared. Fear, suspicion. A man came forward, the headman. He looked at Miller's shattered ankle. He looked at their desperate faces. A long silence. The entire village held its breath. A Japanese patrol had been through just yesterday. One wrong move, One word. The headman looked at the sky, then at the jungle. He seemed to be weighing the fate of his people against the lives of these three strangers. He turned to a woman and spoke a single quiet word. She disappeared into a hut. She returned with a bowl of rice. Hot, steaming rice. The headman pointed to a hut on the edge of the village. He made a sleeping gesture. Stay. Then he held a finger to his lips. Silence. Absolute silence. That night, as the three airmen lay in the dark, listening to the alien sounds of the jungle, they heard something else. A new sound. Faint at first, then growing louder. The unmistakable rhythmic chug of a truck's engine. An engine coming closer. Closer. It wasn't an American engine. They knew the sound. All of them knew the sound. It was a Japanese patrol. And it was stopping right outside their hut. September 9th, 1945. Morotai. The swords were laid down, but the ghosts remained. On a makeshift stage near the Pito airstrip, the same airstrip built on blood and coral, Lieutenant General Teshima Fusataro of the Imperial Japanese Second Army offered his samurai sword to General Sir Thomas Blamey. The blade was ancient, polished, a work of art forged for a world that no longer existed. Blamey refused it. A symbolic gesture, a cold gesture. The war was over, officially. A piece of paper said so, signed with stiff, formal strokes. The ink dried under the same humid sun that had baked the island for a year. For all the years before. Cameras clicked. The Allied commanders stood straight, their uniforms crisp, their faces grimly satisfied. MacArthur wasn't there. He was in Tokyo Bay, on the Missouri. This was a sideshow, a mop-up. 640 Japanese officers and men surrendered that day. A fraction of the thousands who had died in the jungle, starved, sick, hunted. Their war ended not with a bang, but with a signature, and the quiet shuffling of feet on a dusty field. And then the flags changed. The stars and stripes came down, the Australian blue ensign came down, and the Driekleur, the red, white, and blue of the Netherlands, went up. The Netherlands Indies Civil Administration, the NICA, arrived to reclaim their property. Their colony. They arrived with papers, with ledgers, with plans to restore order. The old order. They saw the American miracle, the sprawling docks at Gotalalamo, the 6,000 feet of runway at Pito, the roads, the hospitals, the power plants. And they saw an asset, an inheritance. The Americans packed their bags. They were going home. The Dutch stayed. For the islanders, it was just another master. A familiar master, but a master nonetheless. Freedom came on the wings of Liberators and Lightnings, and then it left on a Dutch transport ship. The airdrome that had been the busiest in the world, a hornet's nest of steel and thunder, grew quiet. The jungle began its slow, patient work of reclamation. It always did. But what of the others? The ones with no flags, no uniforms, no generals to sign their surrender or their victory. The Filipino villagers, the ones from Sangir, from Talaud, the ones who had been on Morotai for generations. Their names were not on the surrender documents. They were not in the victory parades. Their contribution was filed away, if it was filed at all. A secret memo dated November 1944 from an Allied intelligence officer, a Captain Miller, noted it briefly. The folder was called Local Assets, Unverified. The memo stated, significant assistance rendered by native populations, primarily of Filipino origin. Intelligence on enemy movements, sustenance for downed air crews, guides through impassable terrain. Significant assistance, a clinical phrase for risking everything. For a bowl of rice given to a starving American pilot. For a whispered warning about a Japanese patrol. For a child pointing down the wrong path. A small, innocent lie that saved a dozen lives. These acts were not significant assistance. They were the war. The real war, fought in whispers and shadows. Nobody built them a monument. No one carved their names into stone. The official histories The thick books with glossy photographs spoke of strategy, of logistics, of divisions and corps. They spoke of Blamey, Kruger, Kenny, MacArthur, names, big names. They did not speak of the fisherman who pulled a wounded navigator from the surf. They did not speak of the woman who hid 3 airmen in her hut for a week, feeding them from her own meager stores while Japanese soldiers patrolled just yards away. Their names are lost. Lost to time. Lost to indifference. Rumors existed. An old soldier, a former B-24 gunner named Frank Kowalski, 70 years old living in Ohio, said he remembered a face. Just a face. An old man who gave him water. He didn't speak English. I didn't speak his language, but I knew he was saving my life. That's all he remembered. A face, no name, no place. Just a memory of kindness in a world of absolute horror. The stories were told, yes, but only around village fires in a dialect few outsiders could understand. A legacy passed down, not in print, but in breath. Their defiance was a quiet testament, a testament to a resilience that empires cannot crush. The Japanese had a word for it, Yamato Damashi, the Japanese spirit. But what was the word for this? For the spirit of a small, forgotten people who refused to bow? They faced an army that preached death before dishonor, an army that demanded total submission, and they resisted. Not with guns, not with bombs, but with humanity, a shared piece of fruit, a hidden trail, a silent prayer. These were their weapons, and they were powerful. More powerful than a Zero fighter, more powerful than a knee mortar, because they were weapons of hope. In the face of absolute despair, they chose hope. A small, flickering candle in an all-consuming darkness. That was their legacy. A legacy of defiance, a legacy of life. Someone should make a sketch, a memorial, not a statue of a soldier with a rifle. No more soldiers, no more rifles. Something else, imagine a carving. Not in cold bronze or sterile marble, but in warm teak, the local wood. A circle of figures, their faces indistinct, their bodies thin but strong. They are not looking at the viewer. They are looking up, at the sky. Their hands are cupped, not in prayer, but as if to catch the rain, or to catch a man falling from the sky. Or maybe it's a mosaic, made from the shattered green glass of Coca-Cola bottles left by the GIs, the rusted shell casings from the fighting, the white coral of the beaches. Fragments of war reassembled into a picture of peace. A picture of a face. The face Frank Kowalski remembered. An old man's face etched with lines of worry and kindness. Anonymity as the highest honor. A monument to the unknown helper, to the quiet hero. The archives are mostly silent. The official reports from The Hague, from Canberra, from Washington, D.C. are filled with numbers. 10,700 sorties flown, 253 enemy aircraft destroyed, 46 Allied aircraft lost. Numbers. Clean, hard, indisputable numbers. They measure everything but what mattered. They measure fuel consumption, bomb tonnage, casualty rates. They do not measure courage. They do not measure compassion. Somewhere in a Dutch colonial archive, in a box marked Nika Morotai, Post-Hostilities Assessment, there is likely a report. It probably dismisses the local population as passive or uncooperative. A footnote in the grand, sweeping narrative of colonial restoration. But the truth is not in the archives. The truth is in the soil. It's in the memory of the trees. It's in the whispers that still echo through the villages on a quiet night when the wind blows in from the sea. The whispers of the names that were never written down, and the search for them has only just begun. What is the true price of loyalty in a world consumed by fire? In the suffocating green of a jungle at war, the line between allegiance and betrayal blurs into a single desperate act of humanity. The answers to what happened in those forgotten villages do not reside in the official communiques from the U.S. 31st Infantry Division, nor are they etched onto the surrender sword of Lieutenant General Tashima Fusataro on the Pitoe airstrip. They are not found in the cold statistics of the B-24 liberators that flew from Morotai, where 57 men out of every 100 were lost to the sky. The truth is something quieter, something more profound. It whispers from the tangled, impenetrable curtain of roots belonging to a banyan tree, where Thomas and two other men dug a hole. A hole not for the dead, but for the living. A grave meant to defy a grave. It echoes in the memory of a young man named Booty, his eyes fixed on a white parachute snagged in the high branches, a ghost against the twilight, a fragile promise wrapped in silk. It reverberates in the unnerving quiet that followed the scream of a P-38 Lightning, a vacuum filled not with peace, but with the frantic, shared heartbeat of men hiding other men. These moments are absent from the grand chronicles of the war. They exist only in the space between. Between archival files, between fading memories, between silence. History is written in ink, on maps showing vast blue oceans dotted with green smudges, on documents signed on makeshift stages built on blood and coral. But truth is written in the soil. It is felt in the fear of a strange footstep outside a hut. It is tasted in the shared portion of a meager meal. It is understood in the silent nod that passes between men who do not share a language, only a circumstance. This was not a war of nations, not in those villages. It was a war of individuals, a war against an idea. The idea that one life is worth less than another. The idea that orders must always be obeyed. The airmen fell from the sky as warriors, symbols of a distant conflict. They were hidden in the earth as sons, as brothers, as fragile human beings. This was the ultimate betrayal. It was not a betrayal of an occupying army. It was a betrayal of the neat lines drawn by war. A betrayal of the very concept of an enemy. A betrayal of the expectation that good people would stand by and do nothing. The war ended. Lieutenant van der Zee and his compatriots, those who survived, went home. Their memories a fragmented collage of terror and improbable kindness. The villagers remained, their secrets buried as deep as the men they once protected. Some secrets die with those who kept them. Others live forever, woven into the fabric of a place. The question is not whether these villagers committed an act of treason. The real question is far more unsettling. In a history that celebrates victors and condemns the vanquished, who betrayed whom? The ultimate betrayal, perhaps, was never the one committed with a hidden shovel in the dead of night. The ultimate betrayal is our own forgetting, a silence we are only now finally beginning to break.